Welcome, everybody, to another Village Torah weekly Torah portion discussion. I'm your host, Rabbi Drew. We have not one, but two. We have a bonus. We have a double portion this week. We have Matot-Masei closing out strongly the book of Numbers, Sefer Bamidbar. And this week, we have our summer rabbinic fellow, Emily Dana, presenting on something related to this week's Torah portion. So, Emily, we are so excited to have you not only here with us today, but even better, featured presenter. So take it away.
All right. Hi, everybody. So the first thing we're going to talk about, the whole thing we're going to talk about is really based on the first 4 verses of Parshat Matot. So we're going to ignore the next 6 chapters for right now. We'll talk about those later in the week and various different things. But right now we're just going to talk about the act of making vows and the idea of making vows. Rabbi, would you mind reading the Numbers passage for me?
I don't mind at all. So Moses spoke to the Israelites just as the Lord had commanded Moses. Moses spoke to the heads of the Israelite tribes, saying, "This is what the Lord has commanded. If a man makes a vow to the Lord or takes an oath imposing an obligation on himself, he shall not break his pledge. He must carry out all that has crossed his lips. If a woman makes a vow to the Lord or assumes an obligation while still in her father's household by reason of her youth," verse 5 says, "and her father learns of her vow or her self-imposed obligation and offers no objection, all of her vows shall stand, and every self-imposed obligation shall stand." I'm going to also throw in verse 6, "But if her father restrains her on the day he finds out, none of her vows nor self-imposed obligations shall stand, and the Lord will forgive her since her father restrained her."
The important part is the man taking the vow, because the daughters that we're about to talk about are not the ones taking the vows. They're the ones that get stuck in the playing out of the consequences, there we go, of their father's vows. So we're going to start with the biblical one before I make a comparison to another piece of Western literature that also contains a similar story. We're going to start by looking at Bat Yiftach, the daughter of Jephthah. I just mixed names. Jephthah's daughter, as she is commonly known in the English pronunciation. Her story, Jephthah's story, takes place in Judges 11. Before this passage that we'll read in a second, Jephthah has made a vow, or Jephthah, who is the son of a harlot and therefore a relatively illegitimate child, is faced with this military conquest or military challenge, I suppose. And he makes a promise to the Lord that and we'll read this in a second, if he can come home safely and all of his men can come home safely, and if he can defeat the Ammonites, who are the people that he is faced with, then whatever comes out of his front door first will be sacrificed to the Lord. So now we're going to read just a couple of verses from Judges 11, and then we'll also read from a little bit later in Judges 11 as well. Judges 11:28 reads, "But the king of the Ammonites paid no heed to the message that Jephthah sent him. Then the Spirit of the Lord came upon Jephthah. He marched through Gilead and Manasseh, passing Mizpeh of Gilead, and from Mizpeh of Gilead he crossed over to the Ammonites. And Jephthah made the following vow to the Lord: If you deliver the Ammonites into my hands, then whatever comes out of the door of my house to meet me on my safe return from the Ammonites shall be the Lord's and shall be offered by me as a burnt offering." This is just a kind of sacrifice that the ancient Israelites made towards the Lord. So Jephthah goes out. He's able to defeat the Ammonites. Everything's great. He comes back. That's when we end up with a little bit of a problem. So now we read in Judges 11:34 through 36, When Jephthah arrived at his home in Mizpah, There was his daughter coming out to meet him with timbrel and dance. She's celebrating. It's exciting that he's won this war victory, etc. She was an only child. He had no other son or daughter. On seeing her, he rent his clothes and said, "Alas, daughter, you have brought me low. You have become my troubler, for I have uttered a vow to the Lord, and I cannot retract." "Father," she said, "you have uttered a vow to the Lord. Do to me as you have vowed, seeing that the Lord has vindicated you against your enemies, the Ammonites." So, as we remember, Jephthah said the first thing to come out of his door, he was hoping it would be an animal of some sort, something that a cow, sheep, etc., one of the normal things that they would sacrifice anyway to the Lord. Instead, his daughter comes out and is eventually sacrificed, and he is distraught. He renting his clothes is like tearing and ripping apart his clothes. It's a practice that we do when we're in mourning of somebody, or I suppose something if you're Jeremiah. And he's absolutely distraught. But he made this vow, and she knows the rules, or seems to know the rules. You can't take back that vow once you've made that vow to God. And so she asks for a little more time before she is then sacrificed, but that's how the rest of the story plays out. This is one of my favorite stories, which feels a little bit weird to say, but it's an interesting story to me because, as some of you might know, I also studied Greek and Latin mythology in college and post-college as well. And this story has always reminded me of the story of Iphigenia, chronicled in Euripides as well as other places, although this is from the Euripides that I'm quoting here. Agamemnon makes almost exactly the same vow to the goddess Artemis in this particular case. Sometimes it's Zeus, it depends on the source, to sacrifice whatever the best thing of this particular year. So his daughter is born also in that particular year. And he doesn't think it's going to be his daughter. So when he finds out that the fairest thing is his daughter, she is then sacrificed at Aulis, and she dies, and also that results in a lot of bad things for Agamemnon, but the parallels of the story are not lost on me, of this idea of the father's daughter getting sacrificed in order for the father to achieve a vow that has nothing to do with the daughter specifically. So it's not, I vow to find my daughter a great husband, or I vow to have great wealth, or any of these things that actually would affect, I mean, I suppose getting killed in a war would affect the daughter, but still, that being said, it's a different kind of thing. But then we go back, I would like to just keep the Numbers text in front of us as we're talking about this and concluding this a little bit, because we have to remember that vows were taken very seriously. It wasn't a promise that was just like, oh, I promise I'll be home on time. It was not a lightly taken promise, and it should not have been taken lightly. And who knows if it seems that Jephthah regrets taking this vow. He can't go back on the vow. He has to, he must fulfill the qualifications, consequences, I guess, of the vow. However, he is completely distraught at the fact that he's going to have to sacrifice his daughter. That's absolutely terrible to him. He seems to, she's his only child, at least at this point in Judges. So he's sacrificing his only child, which I think actually makes it worse than Agamemnon sacrificing Iphigenia, although that is for somebody else to say whether or not Agamemnon actually regretted sacrificing Iphigenia. I just find the parallels very interesting. And I also find this idea of how we take vows very interesting. Obviously, none of us are going, or hopefully none of us are going into war anytime soon. However, we all make promises and vows and have these kinds of conversations, sometimes very lightly and sometimes not as lightly. And I just want to challenge us to think a little bit more when we promise, both to each other and to ourselves and to God, if that's what you believe in, as we go into this Shabbat, and we are going to we'll read this on Shabbat. That's my spiel.
Cool. Can I add my 2 cents?
You are welcome to add your 2 cents.
Great. Okay. So I find it really fascinating that, so we do have, when I did mention, can you see the numbers piece now?
Yes.
Okay. So I did mention what I find deeply fascinating about the contrast, the comparison between the story and this legislation. If a woman makes a vow, her father can get rid of it. But if a father makes a vow, the daughter cannot get rid of it. There's an asymmetry there. And here it would be, I see in this Yiftach's daughter, Jephthah's daughter incident, that this would be the exact example of how asymmetrically this is sort of problematic. And so, if she had made a similar vow, well, he could undo it. Here, she has no voice in that. And actually, it's really fascinating because she says, "You've uttered a vow to the Lord. Do to me as you have vowed." So she acknowledges this is the proper thing to do, seeing that the Lord has vindicated you against your enemies, the Ammonites. And she said, but what's fascinating is also her response. She acknowledges that this is the right and proper thing to do, that she be sacrificed because of her father's vow. And I mean, look, I see the depth of this whole incident as a sort of a critique and a bit of a criticism on the asymmetry here of a man being able to undo women's vows, but not vice versa. But she ultimately, what's her voice in the story? So she wants to be able to go with her companions and lament and bewail her maidenhood and so forth. What I find further fascinating is ultimately later on the rabbis see that this is a problem, and that there needs to be mechanisms in order to undo vows. And it's funny because the way that the rabbis talk about it, they said, well, they could have just gone to the high priest. Why not just go to the high priest and undo the vow? That would have worked, except that is a post-biblical legal mechanism to be able to undo the vows. But at this time, they didn't have that yet. They had not yet developed those sort of out, like an out of the vow. But that's what I find particularly fascinating about these two stories in conversation with each other, which is, this is the sort of the tragic extreme of this legislation, and and it's a critique of it.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if the imbalance, though, is what Jephthah's daughter is. Well, first of all, poor girl doesn't even get a name, so she really doesn't even get humanity here.
Right.
Um,
Well, that's actually pretty common for biblical stories.
Oh, I'm aware.
Women's names aren't so important. Although the Book of Judges, women feature prominently,
there are
so you
some
would have
pretty
guessed.
prominent women in Judges.
Right. Although I think it actually points up all the more so her relationship to her father, that she's not really an independent person without her father, and that she and it goes back to exactly this week's Torah portion where it's the father-daughter relationship, that he controls the power in that relationship, especially insofar as it concerns vows.
Yeah.
And he's made this vow. She has no legal mechanism. She even acknowledges it. This is the right and proper thing to do. You got to sacrifice me. So obviously a tragedy, and there are other tragedies in the Book of Judges, really interesting stories going on. But this, I think, points up this. I think it's specifically we don't see a lot of father-daughter stuff within the 5 books of Moses, and certainly not even in the Book of Numbers. And so this is a rare occurrence in this week's Torah portion.
I mean, Deuteronomy. You said the 5 books of Moses, not even in the. Oh, okay.
We're in the Book of Numbers.
Yeah,
so not even here in the Book of Numbers, where look, we talk about fathers, daughters, and so forth, but here it's very specific legislation of a father with regards to his daughter. We don't encounter that so often, and so I think that's what this is specifically pointing up, that she is called the daughter of Jephthah because it's highlighting the relationship to her father, which goes back to this legislation in this week's Torah portion. Emily, thank you so much for A, leading this conversation, B, shedding some light on this week's Torah portion and conversation with something that pops up in the later biblical book of Judges. So thank you so much, Emily.
Thanks.
All
Shabbat
right.
shalom, everybody.
Shabbat shalom.